When people today talk about the relationship between the United States and China, they often describe it as a rivalry, a strategic competition, even a new kind of Cold War. But this relationship did not begin with aircraft carriers in the Pacific or tariffs on steel and semiconductors. It began with fragile wooden ships crossing vast oceans, with merchants, missionaries, and diplomats trying to understand a civilization that had been old for thousands of years when the United States itself was brand new. The story of the United States and China is not a straight line toward conflict. It is a long, complicated dance of curiosity and fear, trade and ideology, partnership and suspicion, shaped by wars, revolutions, and the shifting balance of global power. In the late 18th century, the United States was a young republic on the edge of the Atlantic world, eager to prove its independence not only politically but economically. American merchants were hungry for trade beyond Europe, and China, under the Qing dynasty, represented one of the most sophisticated and wealthy markets in the world. In 1784, just months after the Treaty of Paris recognized American independence, the merchant ship Empress of China sailed from New York to Canton, the port now known as Guangzhou. That voyage is often remembered as the symbolic beginning of formal commercial ties between the two countries. The Americans brought ginseng, furs, and silver, and they returned with tea, silk, and porcelain, goods that would become staples of elite and middle-class life in the United States. At this stage, there was no grand strategy, no ideological struggle. The relationship was defined by trade and by a profound imbalance in knowledge. China, governed by a Confucian imperial system, saw itself as the center of civilization, a world order in which foreign states were expected to acknowledge the emperor's superiority. The United States, by contrast, saw itself as a modern republic built on Enlightenment principles, commercial ambition, and a belief in expansion. These two worldviews barely touched at first, connected through the tightly regulated Canton system, under which Western traders were confined to specific areas and subject to strict rules. By the early 19th century, American trade with China had grown, and so had American ambitions. The United States watched as European powers, especially Britain, pushed more aggressively into China, culminating in the Opium Wars of the 1840s. These conflicts forced the Qing government to sign so-called unequal treaties, opening more ports to foreign trade and granting extraterritorial rights to Westerners. The United States, eager not to be left behind, but also keen to present itself as less predatory than the European empires, negotiated its own agreement, the Treaty of Wanxia in 1844. This treaty secured many of the same privileges for Americans as those won by Britain, including the right for American citizens in China to be tried by American courts rather than Chinese ones. From the Chinese perspective, this period marked the beginning of what later historians would call the Century of Humiliation, a time when foreign powers carved out spheres of influence and undermined imperial sovereignty. The United States was not the dominant force in this process, but it was undeniably part of the system that weakened Qing authority. American missionaries followed traders, establishing schools, hospitals, and churches across China. Some Chinese saw these institutions as sources of modern knowledge and medicine. Others viewed them as tools of cultural invasion. At the same time, the United States was undergoing its own transformations. The gold rush, the construction of railroads, and westward expansion created a demand for labor that drew thousands of Chinese migrants to American shores in the mid-19th century. They worked in mines, on rail lines, and in cities, often under brutal conditions and for low pay. Their presence, however, triggered fierce backlash. Economic anxiety, racial prejudice, and political opportunism combined to produce waves of anti-Chinese violence and discrimination. This culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major U.S. law to bar immigration based on nationality. While American diplomats spoke of friendship and fair dealing in China, Chinese communities in the United States faced legal exclusion and social hostility. This contradiction would echo through the relationship for generations. Meanwhile, China itself was in turmoil. Internal rebellions, like the Taiping Rebellion, and external pressures from foreign powers weakened the Qing dynasty. Reformers within China debated how to respond. Some argued for adopting Western technology and military methods while preserving Confucian values. Others believed deeper political change was necessary. American observers, including missionaries and diplomats, often saw China as a civilization in crisis, a vast society struggling to adapt to a world increasingly dominated by industrialized Western states. At the end of the 19th century, the United States emerged as a more assertive global power. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, it acquired overseas territories such as the Philippines, bringing American forces closer to East Asia than ever before. This expansion coincided with a new phase of international competition in China. European empires and Japan were carving out spheres of influence, gaining control over ports, railways, and resources. Fearing that China might be divided into colonies and that American trade would be shut out, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay proposed what became known as the open door policy. In a series of diplomatic notes, beginning in 1899, he urged the major powers to respect China's territorial integrity and to allow equal commercial access to all. The open door policy was framed as a defense of Chinese sovereignty and fair trade, but it also served clear American interests. It reflected a belief that the United States, without a large colonial empire in China, could still secure influence through economic means and diplomacy. For China, the policy offered limited protection against outright partition, but it did not end foreign control or intervention. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900, an anti-foreign uprising supported by elements within the Qing court, led to a multinational military intervention that included American troops. The suppression of the rebellion resulted in heavy indemnities imposed on China, further deepening resentment. In the early 20th century, revolutionary ideas spread within China. Nationalists, intellectuals, and reformers questioned the legitimacy of the Qing dynasty and looked to models abroad, including the United States, for inspiration. Figures such as Sun Yat-sen admired aspects of American constitutionalism and republicanism. When the Qing dynasty finally collapsed in 1911, ending more than 2,000 years of imperial rule, the United States was one of the foreign powers watching closely. The new Republic of China, however, was fragile, beset by warlordism, regional fragmentation, and political conflict. During the interwar period, the United States maintained a complicated stance. American missionaries and educators played significant roles in Chinese universities and institutions. American cultural influence, from film to literature, spread in urban centers like Shanghai. At the same time, U.S. policymakers were wary of becoming too deeply entangled in China's internal struggles. Japan's growing aggression in East Asia, especially after its invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and its full-scale war against China in 1937, forced a shift. Images of bombed cities and civilians suffering in China stirred American public opinion. The United States gradually moved from neutrality to support for the Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek. World War II transformed the relationship dramatically. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States and China became formal allies against a common enemy. American aid, military advisors, and supplies flowed to China, though cooperation was often strained by corruption, logistical challenges, and mutual misunderstandings. Still, the wartime alliance gave China a seat among the major allied powers. At the end of the war, China was recognized as one of the Big Four, and it became a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. For a moment, it seemed possible that the United States and a unified China might build a stable post-war partnership. That hope quickly unraveled. The Chinese Civil War, which had paused during the fight against Japan, resumed between the nationalists and the communists led by Mao Zedong. American policymakers were divided over how much and how directly to support Chiang Kai-shek's government. Some believed that a non-communist China was essential to the balance of power in Asia. Others saw the nationalists as deeply flawed and doubted that American intervention could determine the outcome. By 1949, the communist forces had triumphed. Mao proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China in Beijing, while the nationalist government retreated to Taiwan. For the United States, this was a shock of historic proportions. In the early Cold War atmosphere, the loss of China became a charged political issue. Critics accused the Truman administration of failing to prevent a communist takeover in the world's most populous country. Washington refused to recognize the new government in Beijing and instead continued to recognize the Republic of China on Taiwan as the legitimate government of all China. Diplomatic relations between the United States and the People's Republic were effectively severed. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, turned estrangement into open military confrontation. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea, the United States led a United Nations coalition to defend the South. As U.S. and allied troops pushed north toward the Chinese border, Chinese leaders feared encirclement and intervention. In late 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteer soldiers crossed into Korea, pushing U.S. forces back. For American soldiers, China was no longer a distant, mysterious civilization. It was a battlefield adversary. For Chinese leaders, the war reinforced the perception that the United States sought to contain and threaten the new communist state. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the two countries stood on opposite sides of a global ideological divide. The United States forged alliances across Asia, including with Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, building a network of military bases and security treaties. It supported Taiwan diplomatically and militarily, even signing a mutual defense treaty in 1954. The Taiwan Strait became a flashpoint, with artillery duels and crises that raised fears of a larger war. In China, the leadership pursued radical domestic campaigns, from the Great Leap Forward to the Cultural Revolution, while presenting itself as a champion of anti-imperialist struggle worldwide. Yet even at the height of hostility, the relationship was not static. The Sino-Soviet split in the late 1950s and 1960s, as China and the Soviet Union fell out over ideology and leadership of the communist world, opened new strategic possibilities. American leaders began to reconsider their approach. Instead of seeing communism as a monolithic bloc, they saw an opportunity to exploit divisions. At the same time, China, isolated and facing a powerful Soviet neighbor, had its own reasons to explore new diplomatic options. This convergence of interests led to one of the most dramatic diplomatic openings of the 20th century. In 1971, secret contacts paved the way for U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to visit Beijing. The following year, President Richard Nixon made his historic trip to China, meeting Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai. The images of an American president in Beijing signaled a profound shift. The two countries did not suddenly become friends, and many disputes remained, but they agreed on the value of balancing Soviet power and expanding contact. The Shanghai Communique of 1972 laid the foundation for a new phase. The United States acknowledged that there was one China and that Taiwan was part of China, while maintaining its own unofficial ties with Taipei. Both sides emphasized the importance of peaceful coexistence despite differences, in social systems. Over the rest of the decade, cultural, scientific, and economic exchanges slowly expanded. In 1979, under President Jimmy Carter, the United States formally recognized the People's Republic of China and established full diplomatic relations, while simultaneously passing the Taiwan Relations Act to maintain unofficial ties and provide defensive arms to Taiwan. Normalization marked the beginning of an era in which cooperation and competition would be tightly intertwined. China, under Deng Xiaoping, was launching economic reforms and opening to the world. American companies saw vast opportunities in a country of hundreds of millions of potential workers and consumers. Students from China began studying in the United States in growing numbers, and trade volumes climbed rapidly. For many in Washington, engagement with China was not only economically beneficial but strategically wise. A more prosperous, globally integrated China, they believed, might gradually become more open and perhaps more politically liberal. But this vision was never uncontested, and events repeatedly tested the relationship. In 1989, the violent suppression of protests in Beijing's Tiananmen Square shocked American public opinion and led to sanctions and a temporary freeze in high-level contacts. Yet the strategic logic of engagement endured. After the Cold War ended, the United States emerged as the sole superpower, while China continued its steady rise, achieving decades of rapid economic growth. By the time China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, it had become a central hub of global manufacturing, deeply embedded in supply chains that linked it to American consumers and corporations. As the 21st century unfolded, the very success of this economic integration began to generate new tensions. American industries complained of unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, and state subsidies that distorted competition. Chinese leaders, for their part, saw efforts by the United States to maintain military alliances and presence in Asia as attempts to contain China's rightful resurgence. The relationship increasingly combined dense economic interdependence with growing strategic mistrust. Military modernization, disputes in the South China Sea, and concerns over technology and cybersecurity added new layers of friction. At the same time, cooperation did not disappear. The two countries worked together on issues such as climate change negotiations, global financial stability during crises, and efforts to curb nuclear proliferation. Each side recognized that in a deeply interconnected world, complete decoupling was neither simple nor without cost. By the late 2010s, trade disputes escalated into what many called a trade war, with tariffs imposed on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods. Technology became a central battleground, from telecommunications networks to advanced semiconductors. Political rhetoric on both sides hardened, and public opinion grew more skeptical. Yet even amid rivalry, trade continued, students still crossed the Pacific, and diplomatic channels remained open, however strained. The history of the United States and China is therefore not a story of inevitable confrontation or inevitable partnership. It is a story shaped by shifting power, clashing ideas, economic incentives, domestic politics, and the personalities of leaders. It stretches from the age of sail to the digital era, from tea and silk to artificial intelligence and rare earth minerals. At every stage, choices made in Washington and Beijing have been influenced not only by the other side, but by internal debates over identity, security, and the meaning of national destiny. As China's economic weight grew, so did its confidence on the world stage. The reforms that began under Deng Xiaoping had unleashed forces that transformed not only coastal cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou, but also the global economy itself. Factories in China produced electronics, clothing, machinery, and consumer goods that filled American stores. Shipping lanes across the Pacific became the arteries of a new kind of relationship, one in which the daily lives of ordinary people in both countries were quietly connected through supply chains, investment flows, and financial markets. American consumers benefited from lower prices, and American companies benefited from lower production costs and access to a vast labor force. China accumulated enormous foreign exchange reserves, much of them invested in U.S. government debt, creating a financial interdependence that would have seemed unimaginable during the era of the Korean War. Yet this deepening economic relationship unfolded alongside political systems that remained fundamentally different. The United States continued to define itself as a liberal democracy, grounded in competitive elections, free speech, and the rule of law. China, led by the Communist Party, maintained a one-party system, prioritizing political stability, economic development, and national unity under centralized authority. For years, many American policymakers hoped that economic integration would gradually narrow these differences, encouraging legal reforms, civil society, and perhaps eventually political liberalization in China. This expectation was never a formal agreement, but it hovered in the background of engagement policy, shaping debates in Congress, universities, and corporate boardrooms. Inside China, however, leaders drew different lessons from history. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 served as a cautionary tale. Chinese officials studied how rapid political reform and economic turmoil had weakened Soviet authority, concluding that maintaining party control was essential to avoid chaos and national fragmentation. At the same time, they embraced market mechanisms and global trade as tools to strengthen the country. This combination of economic openness and political control became a defining feature of China's development path, challenging assumptions in the West about the link between markets and democracy. As the new century progressed, areas of friction multiplied. One major source of tension involved trade imbalances. The United States consistently imported far more goods from China than it exported there, contributing to a large bilateral trade deficit. Critics in the United States argued that this reflected not only market forces, but also Chinese policies such as currency management, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, and barriers to foreign firms. Entire communities in parts of the United States, especially those dependent on manufacturing, experienced job losses and economic disruption that were often linked, in public debate, to competition from China. While economists pointed to the role of automation and broader globalization, China became a symbol of anxiety about economic change. Technology emerged as another central arena. In earlier decades, American companies had often been eager to transfer technology to China in exchange for market access. Over time, however, concerns grew about intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, and the strategic implications of China's push into advanced sectors such as telecommunications, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy. Chinese initiatives to move up the value chain were seen in Beijing as natural steps in national development, but in Washington, they were increasingly viewed through the lens of strategic competition. Technologies once considered purely commercial began to be seen as having military and security dimensions. Military dynamics in the Asia-Pacific region also evolved. For decades after World War II, the United States had maintained naval and air superiority across much of the Pacific, underpinned by alliances and forward-deployed forces. As China's economy expanded, so did its defense budget. The People's Liberation Army invested in modern ships, aircraft, missiles, and cyber capabilities. Particular attention focused on the South China Sea, a region of strategic shipping routes and potential resources. China's construction of artificial islands and military facilities there raised alarms among neighboring states and the United States, which emphasized freedom of navigation and international law. American naval patrols and Chinese assertions of sovereignty sometimes brought ships and aircraft into close proximity, underscoring the risk of miscalculation. Taiwan remained one of the most sensitive issues. Since normalization in 1979, the United States had walked a careful line, acknowledging Beijing's position that there is one China while maintaining unofficial ties with Taipei and providing defensive arms. Over time, Taiwan developed into a vibrant democracy and a major player in high-tech industries, especially semiconductors. For Beijing, reunification with Taiwan remained a core national objective, tied to historical narratives of territorial integrity. For Washington, preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and supporting Taiwan's ability to defend itself became central to regional strategy. Periodic crises, arms sales, and political visits tested the balance, each side wary of actions that might shift the status quo. Despite these tensions, cooperation did not vanish. The global financial crisis of 2008 highlighted how intertwined the two economies had become. Chinese demand and financial stability were important factors in global recovery, while the health of the U.S. financial system affected China's massive holdings of dollar-denominated assets. Leaders from both countries participated in multilateral forums such as the G20, where coordination was necessary to prevent deeper economic collapse. Climate change offered another area of both friction and partnership. As the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases, the United States and China were central to global efforts to address environmental challenges. Bilateral agreements and joint announcements helped pave the way for broader international accords, even as domestic debates in both countries complicated implementation. Public opinion, however, grew more cautious. In the United States, surveys showed rising concern about China's economic practices, human rights record, and global ambitions. In China, state media and education emphasized a narrative of national rejuvenation after past humiliations, often portraying foreign criticism as attempts to contain China's rise. Historical memory played a powerful role. American discussions sometimes referenced the Cold War and the importance of defending a rules-based order. Chinese discourse often reached back to the 19th century and the era of unequal treaties, reinforcing sensitivity to issues of sovereignty and external pressure. Leadership changes added new variables. In China, the rise of Xi Jinping marked a period of more centralized authority and a more assertive foreign policy tone. Campaigns against corruption, emphasis on party discipline, and a vision of national rejuvenation signaled confidence, but also tighter political control. Internationally, initiatives such as the Belt and Road sought to expand China's economic and infrastructure links across Asia, Africa, and Europe. In Washington, different administrations adjusted tactics, but increasingly converged on the view that the relationship was entering a phase of strategic competition. Policies aimed at protecting critical technologies, reviewing foreign investments, and strengthening alliances in the Indo-Pacific reflected this shift. The trade war that erupted in the late 2010s made these tensions visible to the wider public. Tariffs were imposed in multiple rounds, justified by the United States as responses to unfair practices and by China as necessary countermeasures. Businesses on both sides felt the impact, as did farmers, manufacturers, and consumers. Negotiations produced partial agreements, but underlying structural issues remained. The language of partnership gave way more often to talk of decoupling, resilience, and supply chain security. At the same time, global challenges continued to require communication. The outbreak of a major pandemic in the early 2020s added new strains, including disputes over transparency, origins of the virus, and the flow of medical supplies. Travel restrictions, visa limits, and heightened scrutiny of academic and research ties reduced some of the people-to-people exchanges that had once been a stabilizing force. Yet scientists, health officials, and international organizations still needed channels of information sharing, illustrating how even rivalry did not eliminate mutual dependence. Throughout this long history, one pattern stands out. Periods of cooperation often grew out of shared interests in stability, trade, or balancing other powers. Periods of confrontation tended to arise when leaders perceived threats to core security or ideological principles. Domestic politics in both countries repeatedly shaped foreign policy. American debates over jobs, human rights, and national security influenced attitudes toward China. Chinese concerns about sovereignty, regime legitimacy, and national unity influenced responses to the United States. Misunderstandings, stereotypes, and historical grievances complicated efforts to build trust. The relationship has also been shaped by individuals who interpreted their country's interests in different ways. Merchants who first sailed to Canton saw opportunity more than ideology. Missionaries believed they were bringing moral and educational uplift, while many Chinese saw cultural intrusion. Leaders like Mao Zedong and Harry Truman viewed each other through the lens of revolutionary struggle and containment. Later figures, from Richard Nixon and Zhu Enlai to Deng Xiaoping and American presidents at the end of the Cold War, made pragmatic choices that redefined possibilities. In the present era, decisions by political leaders, military planners, and economic policymakers continue to influence whether competition remains bounded or slides into deeper confrontation. Geography, too, exerts its quiet influence. The Pacific Ocean separates the two countries, but it also connects them, serving as a highway for trade and a theater for naval power. East Asia's dense network of states, each with its own history and alliances, means that the US-China relationship never exists in isolation. Japan, Korea, Southeast Asian nations, India, Australia, and European partners all shape and are shaped by the balance between Washington and Beijing. Actions taken by one side are interpreted not only bilaterally, but in the broader regional and global context. Looking back over more than 2 centuries, it becomes clear that the United States and China have moved through multiple phases: distant commercial contact, uneasy coexistence amid imperialism, wartime alliance, Cold War hostility, cautious rapprochement, deep economic engagement, and renewed strategic rivalry. None of these phases was permanent. Each grew out of specific historical conditions, and each contained seeds of the next. Understanding this layered past helps explain why the relationship today is so complex, resisting simple labels of friend or foe. It is a relationship in which cooperation and competition are not opposites, but often occur at the same time, in different domains, driven by shifting calculations of interest, identity, and power. A strategic rivalry became a more common description of the relationship. Both countries began re-examining long-held assumptions about the international system itself. For much of the period after the Cold War, the global order had been shaped heavily by American institutions, norms, and alliances. Trade rules, financial institutions, and security arrangements reflected a world in which the United States possessed unmatched military reach and economic influence. China's rise, however, introduced a different center of gravity. Chinese leaders argued that existing institutions should better reflect the voices and interests of developing countries, and they supported the creation of new mechanisms, from development banks to regional trade initiatives, that complemented or sometimes competed with Western-led structures. From Washington's perspective, this raised questions not only about power but about rules. American officials often framed concerns in terms of a rules-based international order, arguing that freedom of navigation, open markets, and peaceful resolution of disputes were principles that benefited all. Chinese officials responded that rules should not be tools for preserving the dominance of a few countries and that historical context mattered, including the long period when China had little say in global governance. These debates were not abstract. They played out in negotiations over infrastructure projects, telecommunications standards, maritime claims, and development financing across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Economic ties, meanwhile, grew more politically charged. Supply chains that once seemed like purely commercial arrangements were reinterpreted as potential vulnerabilities. American policymakers spoke increasingly of economic security and critical dependencies, especially in areas such as rare earth minerals, pharmaceuticals, and advanced chips. Chinese policymakers likewise emphasized self-reliance in key technologies, promoting domestic innovation and reducing reliance on foreign suppliers. The result was not an immediate severing of economic ties, but a gradual reconfiguration, with some sectors becoming more restricted even as others continued to trade. People-to-people exchanges, long considered a stabilizing element, also came under strain. For decades, students, scholars, and tourists had traveled in large numbers between the two countries, building personal networks and institutional partnerships. These exchanges fostered mutual understanding, but also, at times, suspicion. Concerns about espionage, influence operations, and academic freedom led to tighter scrutiny in research collaborations and visa policies. Yet many universities, businesses, and local communities on both sides continued to see value in engagement, highlighting the diversity of views within each country. Information and perception became battlegrounds in their own right. The digital age meant that narratives about each country spread quickly, often shaped by media, political rhetoric, and online discourse. In the United States, stories about human rights issues, censorship, and surveillance in China influenced public attitudes. In China, coverage often emphasized social problems, political polarization, and racial tensions in the United States, reinforcing a view that Western criticism was hypocritical. These mutual perceptions affected the political space for compromise, as leaders had to respond not only to strategic calculations, but to domestic audiences with strong views. At the same time, the two countries remained central to addressing global challenges that no nation could solve alone. Climate change continued to loom as an existential issue. Even when political relations were tense, subnational actors, scientists, and diplomats sought ways to coordinate on emissions reduction, clean energy technology, and environmental protection. Public health, food security, and financial stability likewise required some level of communication. The paradox of the relationship became clearer. The more the two countries competed for influence, the more their actions still shaped a shared global environment. Military planners on both sides devoted increasing attention to crisis management. With more ships, aircraft, and surveillance systems operating in close proximity, especially in the Western Pacific, the risk of accidents or miscalculations grew. Mechanisms such as hotlines, confidence-building measures, and codes of conduct were discussed as ways to prevent incidents from escalating. History weighed heavily here. Leaders understood that earlier eras of great power rivalry had sometimes slid into war through misperception and rigid alliances. The challenge was to compete without crossing lines that neither side truly wanted to cross. Domestic transformations continued to influence foreign policy. In the United States, debates about inequality, industrial policy, and the future of work shaped attitudes toward trade and globalization. Calls to rebuild domestic manufacturing and invest in infrastructure were often linked to the need to remain competitive with China. In China, leadership emphasized national unity, technological progress, and social stability as pillars of continued development. Policies aimed at poverty reduction, urbanization, and digital infrastructure were presented as evidence that the country's system could deliver results at scale. Throughout, history remained a silent but powerful presence. Chinese officials frequently invoked the long arc from past weakness to present strength, portraying current policies as steps toward national rejuvenation. American leaders often drew on narratives of defending freedom and maintaining a favorable balance of power. These historical stories shaped how each side interpreted the other's moves. An American alliance initiative might be seen in Beijing as encirclement, while a Chinese infrastructure project abroad might be seen in Washington as strategic expansion. What makes the US-China relationship particularly complex is that it operates simultaneously on multiple levels. Governments negotiate and compete, militaries plan and posture, companies invest and trade, students study abroad, and families follow news from across the ocean. Decisions in one domain can ripple into others. A trade restriction can affect scientific collaboration. A security dispute can influence tourism or cultural exchange. This interwoven structure means that change is rarely simple or one-dimensional. The future of this relationship will not be determined by a single event or decision. It will emerge from countless choices made in ministries, boardrooms, laboratories, and classrooms, shaped by economic pressures, security concerns, and human aspirations. History suggests that the relationship is capable of dramatic shifts, from hostility to partnership and back again. It also suggests that neither country can fully ignore the other. Their economies, militaries, and global roles are too large, their histories too intertwined over the past 2 centuries. As the story continues into the present, the central question is not only whether the United States and China will compete, but how they will manage that competition. Will they find ways to set boundaries, to cooperate where interests align, and to prevent disputes from spiraling? Or will mistrust harden, reducing space for dialogue and increasing the risk of confrontation? The answers will shape not just bilateral ties, but the broader international landscape, influencing everything from trade patterns to security alliances to the global response to shared challenges. And as in earlier eras, the choices of leaders will matter, but so will the expectations and pressures of the societies they represent, each carrying its own history, hopes, and fears into an uncertain future. If we step back from the headlines and look at the deeper currents, the relationship between the United States and China can also be understood as a long negotiation over status, respect, and the meaning of power in the modern world. From the very beginning, when the first American traders arrived on China's southern coast, both sides were trying to fit the other into an existing mental map. For king officials, foreign merchants were peripheral actors in a tribute-based worldview that placed China at the center. For Americans, China was a distant but enticing market, part of a global commercial system in which sovereign states were supposed to deal with each other as legal equals. That early mismatch in expectations never fully disappeared. It simply took new forms as the international system evolved. In the 19th century, when China was weakened by internal upheaval and foreign pressure, the United States saw both opportunity and moral mission. American diplomats often contrasted their country with European empires, claiming to support China's territorial integrity even as they benefited from unequal treaties. Missionaries believed they were offering education, medicine, and faith, yet their presence was tied to a broader structure of foreign privilege that many Chinese resented. This mixture of idealism and self-interest became a recurring feature of American policy, visible again in later periods when Washington spoke of human rights and international law while also pursuing strategic advantage. For China, memories of that era became part of national identity. The idea that foreign powers once dictated terms on Chinese soil has had a lasting influence on how leaders interpret outside pressure. Policies framed in Washington as defensive or rules-based, can be perceived in Beijing through the lens of past vulnerability. This does not mean that history mechanically determines present choices, but it does mean that symbols, language, and precedent carry unusual weight. Diplomatic gestures that might seem routine elsewhere can be charged with historical meaning in the US-China context. The alliance during World War II briefly aligned the two countries' goals, but even then cooperation was uneasy. American officers on the ground in China often complained about inefficiency and corruption in the nationalist government, while Chinese leaders resented what they saw as condescension and inadequate support. The alliance was built on necessity, not deep trust. When the common enemy disappeared, the underlying political differences quickly resurfaced, and the Cold War hardened them into opposing camps. The decades of hostility after 1949 were not only about ideology, they were also about geography and security. American strategists worried that a communist China allied with the Soviet Union could dominate Asia, threaten sea lanes, and undermine US alliances. Chinese leaders, emerging from civil war and facing US forces in Korea and Taiwan, feared encirclement and invasion. Each side interpreted the other's defensive measures as offensive threats, a classic security dilemma. Nuclear weapons added another layer of danger, even though direct war between the two never occurred after Korea. The opening of the 1970s showed that strategic logic could override deep mistrust. Leaders in both countries demonstrated a willingness to rethink assumptions when faced with a changing balance of power, especially the challenge posed by the Soviet Union. The normalization of relations did not resolve ideological differences, but it created a framework in which those differences could be managed while cooperation expanded. Trade, cultural exchange, and diplomatic dialogue became tools not only of engagement but of mutual influence. As China's economy accelerated in the reform era, American businesses became stakeholders in the relationship. Joint ventures, manufacturing partnerships, and research collaborations created networks of interest that often pushed for stability. At the same time, these ties exposed differences in legal systems, business practices, and political expectations. Disputes over market access, transparency, and regulation were not just technical matters. They reflected deeper contrasts in how each society organized the relationship between state and market. The end of the Cold War removed a shared adversary and left the two countries facing each other more directly. Without the Soviet Union as a counterweight, questions about long-term intentions came to the fore. Was China a partner in a US-led order, a reforming power that would gradually converge with global norms, or a rising challenger seeking to reshape the system? Different American administrations answered these questions in different ways, but over time skepticism grew, especially as China's capabilities expanded and its policies appeared more assertive. In China, views of the United States were also mixed. America was admired for its technology, universities, and cultural influence, yet also criticized for what was seen as interference and double standards. The United States served both as a model in certain domains and as a cautionary example in others. This ambivalence could exist at the same time within the same society, reflecting the complexity of cross-cultural perception. One striking feature of the modern relationship is how domestic and international issues blur together. A decision about export controls on advanced chips is at once an economic measure, a national security policy, and a signal about long-term strategic trust. A speech about human rights can resonate in domestic politics while also affecting diplomatic space. Social media amplifies these interactions, making statements and incidents travel quickly across borders and audiences. All of this unfolds against the backdrop of a world that is no longer unipolar, but not clearly bipolar either. Other countries watch the US-China dynamic closely, adjusting their own policies to avoid being forced into stark choices. Some seek to benefit from economic ties with both, while relying on security relationships to hedge against uncertainty. Their responses, in turn, influence how Washington and Beijing calculate risks and opportunities. In this sense, the relationship is not only about two nations, but about the shape of the 21st century order. Questions about digital governance, infrastructure standards, development finance, and environmental policy are arenas where influence is exercised less through conquest than through norms, technology, and investment. Competition in these areas can be intense, yet it does not always look like traditional rivalry. It often involves offering alternatives, building partnerships, and shaping rules that others will adopt. Still, the possibility of crisis remains real. History shows that periods of shifting power can be unstable, especially when communication falters and intentions are misread. The United States and China both possess vast military capabilities, including nuclear forces, which makes the stakes of miscalculation extraordinarily high. That awareness has so far encouraged caution, even amid sharp disagreements. Mechanisms for dialogue, however limited, serve as guardrails, reminders that the cost of escalation would be borne not only by the two countries, but by the wider world. What began with a single merchant ship seeking tea and silk has become one of the defining relationships of the modern era, stretching across economics, security, culture, and global governance. Its history is not a simple progression from friendship to rivalry or vice versa, but a layered narrative in which cooperation and competition repeatedly coexist. Understanding that layered past does not provide easy answers for the future, but it does reveal a pattern. Moments of greatest danger have often been followed by reassessment, and moments of closest partnership have always contained unresolved tensions. In recent years, another dimension has become more prominent: the contest over ideas about governance, development, and the relationship between the individual and the state. The United States continues to emphasize political pluralism, civil liberties, and a system in which government authority is constrained by law and by electoral accountability. China presents a different model, arguing that long-term planning, social stability, and economic performance are key measures of legitimacy. Chinese officials often point to rapid infrastructure development, poverty reduction, and technological advancement as evidence that their system can deliver tangible results for a vast population. American leaders, in turn, argue that transparency, open debate, and the protection of individual rights are essential not only morally, but also for innovation and resilience. These contrasting narratives do not simply remain within each country's borders. They are part of global conversations, especially in developing nations weighing different paths to growth. Infrastructure financing, digital networks, and education exchanges become channels through which models of governance and development are observed and sometimes emulated. The United States and China are therefore not only competing over markets and territory, but also over influence in how other societies think about modernization and sovereignty. Energy and environmental policy illustrate both the rivalry and the necessity of cooperation. As major industrial powers, both countries have contributed significantly to global emissions, yet both are also central to the transition toward cleaner energy. Competition in solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles can be intense, tied to industrial strategy and jobs. At the same time, scientific research, climate diplomacy, and global targets depend on some level of coordination. When the two countries find common ground in these areas, the effects ripple outward, affecting the pace and direction of global efforts. The digital domain adds another layer of complexity. Data flows, social media platforms, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence are not confined by geography in the same way as traditional industries. Concerns about data security, surveillance, and control over information have led both countries to adopt policies that reflect their political systems and security priorities. Debates over standards for emerging technologies are therefore also debates about values, privacy, and state authority. Companies operating across borders must navigate differing legal environments, while governments worry about dependence on foreign technologies in critical systems. Space, once the realm of superpower rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, has also become an arena where China is an increasingly important actor. Satellite networks, lunar exploration, and space stations carry symbolic weight as markers of technological capability and national prestige. They also have practical implications for communications, navigation, and military operations. Cooperation is possible in scientific research and the management of space debris, yet strategic considerations often limit the scope of joint efforts. All of these developments unfold while both societies are undergoing internal change. Demographic trends, economic restructuring, and social expectations influence national priorities. In the United States, debates about immigration, education, and industrial policy intersect with concerns about maintaining leadership in science and technology. In China, an aging population, regional inequalities, and the need to shift from export-driven growth to domestic consumption shape policy choices. These domestic pressures can either encourage outward engagement as leaders seek markets and stability, or lead to inward focus and caution. Another enduring theme is the role of crisis in reshaping the relationship. Time and again, moments of shock have forced reassessment. The Korean War hardened hostility. The Sino-Soviet split opened space for rapprochement. The end of the Cold War removed one framework and required a new one. Economic crises, security incidents, and global emergencies have repeatedly tested assumptions. In each case, leaders had to balance immediate pressures with longer-term strategy, sometimes improvising in ways that set lasting precedents. Communication, both formal and informal, has often made the difference between escalation and restraint. Diplomatic channels, military-to-military contacts, academic exchanges, and business dialogues create opportunities to clarify intentions and manage disagreements. When these channels narrow, the risk of misunderstanding grows. History suggests that even during periods of deep mistrust, maintaining some lines of contact can help prevent worst-case scenarios. It is also important to remember that neither the United States nor China is monolithic in its views. Within each country, there are debates about how to handle the relationship. Business leaders may emphasize stability and access to markets. Security officials may stress caution and deterrence. Scholars, journalists, and citizens bring their own perspectives, shaped by experience and values. Policy is often the result of these internal conversations as much as of external events. The cultural dimension, though less visible than trade statistics or military deployments, continues to matter. Literature, film, music, and education shape how societies imagine one another. Periods of openness have allowed richer mutual understanding, while periods of tension have narrowed cultural windows. Misconceptions can flourish when direct contact declines, reinforcing stereotypes and hardening attitudes. Through all these layers, one constant remains. The scale of both countries ensures that their interaction will continue to have global consequences. Decisions about tariffs, technology standards, military deployments, or environmental targets do not stay confined within national borders. They affect supply chains, financial markets, regional security calculations, and the lives of people far beyond Washington and Beijing. The history of competition and cooperation between the United States and China therefore offers more than a bilateral narrative. It is a lens on how great powers adjust to each other's presence, how economic interdependence can coexist with strategic rivalry and how historical memory shapes present choices. The past shows neither permanent enmity nor guaranteed harmony, but a pattern of adaptation under pressure, of friction tempered at times by pragmatism. Over the long sweep of this relationship, a subtle but important shift has taken place in how both countries see time itself. In the early years of contact, interactions were episodic, separated by months of ocean travel and limited communication. Decisions moved slowly, and misunderstandings could linger for years before being corrected. In the modern era, communication is instantaneous, markets react in seconds, and political signals are analyzed in real time by officials, investors, and citizens. This compression of time adds intensity to every disagreement. A single statement, policy announcement, or incident at sea can echo globally within hours, shaping expectations and narrowing room for quiet diplomacy. At the same time, leaders in both countries often speak in terms of long historical arcs. American officials refer to decades of alliance structures, institutional leadership, and the defense of an open international system. Chinese leaders speak of centuries of civilization, a return to centrality after a period of weakness, and long-term national rejuvenation. These different temporal perspectives can coexist uneasily. Short-term tactical moves are interpreted through long-term narratives, sometimes giving them greater symbolic weight than intended. Economic statecraft has become one of the primary tools in this environment. Sanctions, export controls, investment screening, and industrial policy are now central features of the relationship. These measures are justified in the language of national security and resilience, but they also signal mistrust. Each side worries that the other could exploit economic interdependence for leverage. Yet complete separation would carry enormous costs, not only financially, but in terms of innovation and global stability. The result is a selective tightening, where some areas become more restricted while others remain open, creating a complex patchwork rather than a clean break. Regional dynamics in Asia further shape the picture. Countries across the region have deep economic ties with China and long-standing security ties with the United States. They benefit from trade and investment while relying on American military presence to deter conflict. This dual orientation means that regional states often seek to avoid choosing sides, instead encouraging stability and predictable behavior from both major powers. Their responses can moderate tensions or, in some cases, add pressure, depending on how disputes unfold. The maritime domain is especially significant. Much of global trade passes through sea lanes in the Indo-Pacific, making freedom of navigation and access to ports vital interests. Naval patrols, exercises, and alliances serve as signals of commitment and capability. But they also create frequent points of contact, where ships and aircraft operate in close quarters. Professional conduct and communication protocols are crucial in preventing accidents from escalating into political crises. Cyber and information security represent newer frontiers where boundaries are less clearly defined. Accusations of hacking, intellectual property theft, and influence operations have become common. Attribution can be difficult, and norms are still evolving. In this sphere, the line between state and non-state actors is often blurred, adding to uncertainty. Efforts to establish rules of behavior are complicated by differences in political systems and views on information control. Despite the weight of these challenges, the relationship has shown a capacity for compartmentalization. Even when tensions rise in one area, cooperation can persist in another. This pattern reflects pragmatic recognition on both sides that total confrontation would be destructive. It also reflects the diversity of actors involved, from local governments to multinational companies to research institutions, each with its own incentives. Education remains one of the most enduring links. Generations of Chinese students have studied in American universities, and their experiences have shaped perspectives in business, science, and public life back home. American students and scholars who spend time in China gain insights into language, society, and history that cannot be acquired from a distance. When these exchanges flourish, they create reservoirs of understanding that can outlast political cycles. When they decline, the relationship can become more abstract and more easily distorted by fear. The narrative of competition often emphasizes zero-sum outcomes, the idea that one side's gain must be the other's loss. Yet history shows that many periods of US-China interaction have involved positive-sum elements, especially in trade and global problem-solving. The challenge lies in sustaining those areas of mutual benefit while managing disputes that are genuinely difficult, such as questions of sovereignty, military balance, and political values. Ultimately, the relationship is shaped by the choices of human beings operating under constraints, informed by history but not imprisoned by it. Leaders interpret signals, weigh risks, and decide whether to emphasize cooperation or confrontation. Publics respond to economic conditions, media narratives, and personal experiences. Institutions channel these forces, but they do not eliminate uncertainty. The story that began with curiosity across oceans has become a central thread in the fabric of international politics. It reflects the rise of new powers, the persistence of old ideas, and the ongoing search for stability in a changing world. Each generation inherits a relationship already layered with memory and expectation, yet also open to new directions. How those layers are understood and how new chapters are written will continue to influence not only the United States and China, but the global community that lives with the consequences of their interaction. In considering where this long story may lead, it helps to remember that neither country entered the relationship with a fixed blueprint. Again and again, shifts occurred because leaders reassessed risks, because economic realities changed, or because events forced new thinking. The opening to China in the 1970s was not inevitable. It was a calculated gamble taken in a specific strategic moment. China's embrace of market reforms was not preordained. It was a response to domestic hardship and the example of other economies. Likewise, the more competitive tone of recent years has grown out of accumulated grievances, altered power balances, and changing domestic politics on both sides. Power itself has evolved in meaning. In earlier eras, power was measured largely in territory, armies, and industrial output. Today, it also includes control over supply chains, leadership in research, influence in international institutions, and the ability to shape global narratives. In many of these domains, the United States and China are deeply entangled. A breakthrough in one country's laboratories can depend on researchers trained in the other. Financial markets react to policy decisions in both capitals. This interdependence complicates the traditional logic of rivalry. Efforts to weaken a competitor can sometimes damage one's own position, creating a constant tension between competition and self-interest. Trust, always fragile in international affairs, has become a central issue. Trust does not mean agreement, but a belief that the other side's actions will stay within certain bounds. When trust erodes, every move is viewed with suspicion. Military exercises appear as rehearsals for conflict, trade measures as economic coercion, diplomatic initiatives as attempts to isolate. Rebuilding trust is difficult once narratives of hostility take hold, yet history shows that even limited trust, built around specific issues or mechanisms, can help stabilize relations. The Taiwan question remains one of the most sensitive tests of that trust. For Beijing, it is tied to sovereignty and national unity, issues bound up with legitimacy and historical memory. For Washington, it involves commitments to peace, regional stability, and the credibility of its broader security posture. Actions taken by either side are scrutinized for signals about long-term intentions. Managing this issue requires careful signaling, restraint, and an understanding of how easily symbolic gestures can be interpreted as strategic shifts. Economic transformation within China also affects the relationship in subtler ways. As wages rise and the economy moves toward higher-value industries, the nature of competition with the United States changes. It is less about low-cost manufacturing and more about advanced technology, services, and innovation. This can intensify rivalry but also create new areas for collaboration, from healthcare to green technology, if political conditions allow. In the United States, debates about resilience and renewal increasingly intersect with China policy. Investments in infrastructure, science, and education are framed not only as domestic priorities, but as essential to maintaining competitiveness. This inward-looking aspect of strategy suggests that the relationship is influenced as much by what each country does at home as by what it does abroad. Global crises continue to test the ability of the two countries to coordinate or at least avoid working at cross purposes. Financial instability, pandemics, climate events, and regional conflicts create pressures for communication even when political ties are strained. These moments can either deepen mistrust if blame dominates or open limited space for pragmatic cooperation. The broader international community has a stake in how this relationship evolves. Many countries seek a stable environment in which trade can flow, conflicts are contained, and global problems are addressed collectively. They often encourage dialogue, support multilateral frameworks, and resist narratives that frame the world in rigid blocks. Their actions, though sometimes overlooked, can help shape incentives for moderation. Looking back across the centuries, the relationship between the United States and China has repeatedly defied simple predictions. Periods of intense hostility have given way to rapprochement. Moments of optimism have been followed by disappointment. Each phase has left legacies that influence the next. The early experience of unequal treaties still shapes Chinese sensitivity to sovereignty. The Cold War experience still informs American thinking about deterrence and alliances. The decades of economic engagement have created habits of interaction and networks of interest that do not disappear overnight. What endures is the recognition that both countries are central actors in the global system, neither able to ignore the other, neither able to fully control the other's trajectory. Their interaction will continue to combine cooperation where interests align, competition where ambitions collide, and negotiation over the rules that govern an interconnected world. The balance among these elements will shift over time, influenced by leadership choices, domestic developments, and unforeseen events. In that sense, the story remains open. It is still being written in policy meetings, research labs, trading floors, and classrooms. It carries the weight of history, but also the possibility of change. The challenge for both sides, as in earlier turning points, is to recognize not only the sources of conflict, but also the costs of allowing rivalry to become the only defining feature. How they manage that balance will shape not just their own futures, but the contours of international order in the decades to come. Another layer in this unfolding story is the role of economic expectations and disappointment. In the decades after normalization, many American policymakers and business leaders believed that expanding trade would not only generate profits, but also foster convergence. The idea was that as China integrated into global markets, it would adopt more transparent regulatory systems, stronger legal protections, and a greater role for private enterprise independent of the state. Some of these changes did occur. Commercial law developed, foreign firms operated widely, and Chinese entrepreneurs built globally competitive companies. Yet the political system did not evolve in the direction many in the United States had anticipated. The Communist Party retained, and in some areas strengthened, its role in guiding key sectors and setting strategic priorities. From Beijing's perspective, this outcome was not a failure but a success. Leaders argued that maintaining political control while allowing market forces to operate under supervision had delivered decades of growth and lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. They viewed external pressure for political reform as misunderstanding China's history and social conditions. This divergence in expectations gradually fed frustration. Americans who had supported engagement began to question whether their assumptions had been naive, while Chinese officials felt that their achievements were being discounted and their sovereignty challenged. This sense of mutual disappointment has colored many recent disputes. Trade disagreements, for example, are not only about tariffs or specific regulations, they also reflect deeper disagreements about the role of the state in the economy. When American officials criticize subsidies or industrial policies, they are expressing a preference for a more market-driven system. When Chinese officials defend these tools, they see them as legitimate instruments of national development, similar in some respects to policies used historically by other industrializing countries. Each side believes its approach is reasonable, and each suspects the other of seeking advantage under the guise of principle. Security concerns intersect with these economic debates. Advanced technologies such as semiconductors, telecommunications equipment, and artificial intelligence have both civilian and military applications. Restrictions on exports or investment are therefore framed as necessary to protect national security, even when they affect commercial relationships. For companies and researchers, this creates a landscape where decisions once based mainly on cost and innovation must now consider geopolitical risk. At the human level, the relationship is experienced through countless individual stories. A Chinese student arriving at an American university may see opportunity, cultural difference, and sometimes suspicion. An American executive working in a Chinese city may encounter rapid change, regulatory complexity, and vibrant local innovation. Families separated by immigration policies, scientists collaborating across borders, tourists exploring historic sites, all contribute to the lived reality behind official narratives. These experiences can soften stereotypes or, in times of tension, become more difficult and uncertain. Media plays a powerful role in shaping perceptions of these experiences. Stories that emphasize conflict, espionage, or unfair practices can dominate coverage, while quieter examples of cooperation receive less attention. In both countries, political rhetoric can amplify negative images, narrowing the space for nuance. Yet beneath these narratives, practical cooperation often continues in areas such as business operations, academic research, and local government exchanges. The legal and institutional frameworks that manage the relationship have grown more complex over time. Agreements, dialogues, and working groups cover topics ranging from aviation safety to agricultural standards. Even when high-level political ties cool, these technical channels can persist, reflecting the practical need to coordinate in a tightly connected world. They serve as reminders that the relationship is not a single thread, but a dense web of interactions. At moments of heightened tension, historical analogies frequently surface. Some commentators speak of a new Cold War, while others argue that the deep economic interdependence makes such a comparison misleading. History offers lessons, but not exact templates. The ideological confrontation of the 20th century Cold War occurred between largely separate economic blocs. The present situation involves two economies deeply intertwined, even as strategic mistrust grows. This difference complicates both deterrence and cooperation. The pace of technological change adds further uncertainty. Breakthroughs in areas such as quantum computing, biotechnology, and energy storage could shift economic and military balances in ways that are difficult to predict. Both countries invest heavily in research and development, seeing innovation as central to future power. Competition in this domain is intense, yet science itself remains an international enterprise, with knowledge crossing borders through publications, conferences, and collaborations. Environmental pressures, including water scarcity, extreme weather, and resource constraints, also shape long-term calculations. Managing these challenges requires domestic adaptation and international coordination. The actions of the two largest economies and emitters carry particular weight, influencing global markets for energy and technology. In this arena, rivalry can spur innovation, but lack of coordination can undermine collective progress. As the relationship evolves, one persistent question is whether mechanisms can be built to manage rivalry without allowing it to dominate every aspect of interaction. Past experience suggests that clear communication of red lines, crisis management channels, and agreed frameworks for cooperation in specific areas can help reduce risk. Such mechanisms do not eliminate disagreement, but they can create predictability, which is valuable in itself. The United States and China approach these questions from different historical experiences and political traditions. Yet both have shown, at various moments, the capacity for pragmatic adjustment when circumstances demand it. The story of their interaction is therefore not just about rising and established powers, but about the human capacity to reinterpret interests in light of changing realities. Each new development adds another layer to a relationship already shaped by centuries of contact, conflict, and exchange. The future will likely contain further cycles of tension and accommodation, driven by shifts in technology, economics, leadership, and global conditions. The past does not dictate the outcome, but it provides a map of possibilities, showing how easily assumptions can be overturned and how durable certain patterns can be. In this continuing narrative, the central challenge remains the same as in earlier turning points: how to balance competition with restraint, difference with dialogue, and national ambition with the recognition of shared vulnerability in an interconnected world. As the 21st century advances, another factor shaping the relationship is the growing role of domestic public opinion in both countries. In earlier eras, foreign policy was often conducted with limited direct input from the broader population, especially in systems where information traveled slowly. Today, rapid communication, social media, and constant news cycles mean that citizens follow international events closely and react in real time. Leaders must consider not only strategic calculations, but also how their actions will be perceived at home. This can narrow room for compromise, as concessions may be framed as weakness, while firm responses are praised as defending national dignity. In the United States, debates over China policy have increasingly cut across party lines, with concern about economic practices, human rights, and security risks becoming more widely shared. In China, narratives emphasizing national strength and resistance to external pressure resonate strongly with a public aware of historical experiences of foreign domination. These domestic atmospheres can reinforce tougher stances, even when officials privately seek stability. Economic competition is also unfolding within a global system under strain. Supply chain disruptions, financial volatility, and shifting trade patterns have led many countries to reconsider overdependence on any single partner. Policies promoting diversification, resilience, and local production are not directed solely at China, but China's central role in global manufacturing makes it a focal point. At the same time, Chinese firms and investors have become more active abroad, acquiring assets, building infrastructure, and participating in markets worldwide. This outward expansion creates opportunities, but also triggers scrutiny over security, debt, and political influence. The role of alliances and partnerships further differentiates the two countries' approaches. The United States has long relied on formal alliances, particularly in Europe and Asia, as pillars of its strategy. These alliances involve shared planning, joint exercises, and treaty commitments. China, while developing close relationships with various countries, has generally emphasized partnerships that are less formal and more flexible. Each model has advantages and constraints. For the United States, alliance coordination can enhance deterrence, but requires balancing diverse interests. For China, looser arrangements can provide room to maneuver, but may offer less predictable support in crises. In technological ecosystems, standards and regulations are becoming arenas of quiet contest. Decisions about telecommunications infrastructure, digital payment systems, and data governance shape the environment in which future innovations will operate. Countries choosing among different suppliers and standards are influenced not only by cost and performance, but also by political trust and security considerations. Thus, technical choices become strategic ones, linking domestic policy to global alignments. Cultural and educational ties, though sometimes overshadowed by political disputes, remain important reservoirs of connection. Alumni networks, sister city programs, and joint research projects create channels of familiarity that can outlast official tensions. These networks do not determine policy, but they can provide perspectives that complicate simple adversarial narratives. At the same time, the possibility of miscalculation persists. Military encounters in contested regions, cyber incidents, or diplomatic crises could escalate rapidly if communication fails. Both countries study past conflicts among major powers, aware of how quickly spirals of action and reaction can form. This awareness has so far encouraged the maintenance of crisis management tools, even when broader relations are strained. The economic and technological rivalry is likely to remain a defining feature. Efforts to lead in emerging fields such as clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and digital services are tied to long-term prosperity and influence. Competition here can drive innovation, but it also raises the stakes of disputes over market access and intellectual property. Managing this competition without allowing it to undermine global economic stability is a delicate task. Another dimension is the evolving global distribution of power beyond the two countries. India's growth, the role of the European Union, and the ambitions of middle powers all shape the environment in which the United States and China operate. Neither can act in a vacuum. Both must consider how their rivalry affects and is affected by others. Multilateral institutions, though sometimes strained, remain venues where rules and expectations are debated. Throughout this complex landscape, the memory of earlier phases continues to inform choices. The experience of confrontation during the Korean War, the surprise of the diplomatic opening in the 1970s, the optimism of early economic engagement, and the frustrations of more recent disputes all form part of the background against which decisions are made. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it offers analogies that leaders and analysts draw upon when interpreting events. What makes the US-China relationship so consequential is not only the size and power of the two nations, but the breadth of their interaction. Few other bilateral relationships encompass such deep trade ties, military considerations, technological competition, ideological difference, and global impact all at once. This breadth ensures that shifts in one area can reverberate across others, making the relationship dynamic and at times unpredictable. Yet, for all its complexity, the relationship still rests on fundamental choices about risk and restraint. Both countries have reasons to avoid direct conflict, given the potential costs. Both also have incentives to defend what they see as core interests. Navigating between these imperatives requires continual adjustment, dialogue, and at times, deliberate efforts to step back from the edge. The story that began with cautious trade across oceans has become a central thread in the modern international system. It is a story of learning and mislearning, of cooperation born of necessity and competition born of ambition. It reflects the broader human challenge of managing difference in a world where no major power can remain isolated. As new chapters unfold, they will add to a history already rich with turning points, reminders that the relationship has never been static and that its future will be shaped, as in the past, by the interplay of interests, ideas, and choices made under the pressure of events. One of the enduring ironies of this relationship is that the closer the two countries have become in material terms, the more complicated their political and strategic perceptions have grown. In the 19th century, distance limited interaction, but also limited friction. In the present, goods, capital, data, and people move between the two societies at a scale that binds them together even as their governments speak more openly of competition. This combination of proximity and mistrust is historically unusual, and it helps explain why the relationship can feel simultaneously indispensable and unstable. Economic interdependence has created constituencies with a stake in stability. Farmers, exporters, importers, investors, and consumers all feel the effects of policy changes. A tariff is not an abstract diplomatic signal. It can mean higher costs, lost contracts, or disrupted livelihoods. Yet these same interconnections can become sources of leverage or vulnerability, encouraging policymakers to think in terms of pressure and counterpressure. The tools of statecraft now reach deeply into commercial life, blurring the line between geopolitics and everyday economic activity. Security planners face a similar duality. Military forces are positioned to deter and, if necessary, fight, but they operate in an environment where an incident could have economic and political repercussions far beyond the immediate theater. A naval encounter in disputed waters is not just a tactical event. It can influence markets, alliances, and domestic opinion. This amplifies the importance of rules of engagement, communication protocols, and crisis hotlines. Even small gestures of reassurance or restraint can have outsized significance. The technological sphere intensifies this dynamic. Innovation ecosystems depend on collaboration, open research, and global talent flows. At the same time, breakthroughs in areas such as microelectronics, aerospace, and computing are seen as essential to national power. Policies that restrict technology transfer aim to safeguard security, but can also slow the exchange of knowledge that drives progress. Both countries wrestle with how to protect sensitive capabilities without isolating themselves from the broader currents of scientific advancement. Ideology, too, continues to matter, though often in more subtle ways than during the height of the Cold War. Differences in views about governance, rights, and the role of the state shape interpretations of events. A domestic policy in one country can be viewed in the other as evidence of systemic strength or weakness. These interpretations feed into broader narratives about which model is more effective or legitimate. Yet ideology does not fully determine behavior. Pragmatism has repeatedly led both sides to cooperate in specific areas despite profound differences in political systems. Generational change adds another variable. Younger citizens in both countries have grown up in a world where the other nation is a major presence, whether as a market, a source of products, a cultural reference, or a geopolitical competitor. Their perceptions are shaped less by memories of the Korean War or the early days of normalization, and more by contemporary issues such as technology, employment, and global mobility. How these generations interpret the relationship will influence future policy debates. Urbanization and internal development within China have also altered the context. Coastal cities integrated early into global trade, while inland regions developed more gradually. As infrastructure expands and digital connectivity spreads, the domestic market becomes more central to China's growth strategy. This shift can change how China relates to the global economy, potentially reducing some dependencies while creating new ones. For the United States, understanding these internal transformations is important for anticipating how China's external behavior might evolve. In the United States, conversations about competitiveness often focus on education, research funding, and industrial capacity. The relationship with China becomes a reference point in debates over how to revitalize manufacturing, support innovation, and ensure that economic gains are broadly shared. Thus, China policy is intertwined with domestic renewal, reinforcing the idea that international competition begins at home. The legal dimension of the relationship is also significant. Trade disputes are brought to international bodies, contracts are negotiated across jurisdictions, and intellectual property cases cross borders. These legal interactions require shared understandings, even when political trust is limited. The development of legal expertise and institutional familiarity over decades of engagement provides a framework that can outlast particular political cycles. Cultural imagination continues to shape the atmosphere in which policies are made. Films, literature, and popular media influence how each society visualizes the other, sometimes reinforcing stereotypes, sometimes challenging them. These images can affect public support for cooperation or confrontation. Exchanges that humanize the other side can moderate fear, while narratives that emphasize threat can harden attitudes. The global context in which this bilateral story unfolds remains fluid. Economic shifts, environmental pressures, technological disruptions, and political changes in other regions all interact with the US-China dynamic. Neither country controls these broader forces, yet both must respond to them. Their relationship is therefore part of a larger system in motion, where stability depends not only on bilateral choices, but on the health of global institutions and norms. In tracing the arc from early trade to contemporary rivalry, a pattern emerges of recurring recalibration. When conditions change dramatically, old assumptions are revisited. Sometimes this leads to bold initiatives, like the diplomatic opening of the 1970s. At other times, it leads to incremental adjustments, new regulations, or cautious dialogue. The capacity to reassess, to adapt strategies to new realities, has been a recurring feature on both sides. The stakes of this relationship ensure that it will remain under constant scrutiny, analyzed by scholars, officials, businesses, and citizens around the world. Its evolution will influence the structure of global trade, the development of technology, the stability of key regions, and the collective response to shared challenges. It is a relationship shaped by history, but not locked into a single path, defined by competition, but still threaded with cooperation, marked by mistrust, yet sustained by interdependence. As the narrative continues to unfold, one of the most significant questions is how each country interprets the other's intentions over the long term. Intentions are not directly observable. They are inferred from actions, statements, and historical experience. When trust is limited, worst-case assumptions can dominate. A defensive move by one side may be seen as preparation for aggression by the other. Breaking this cycle requires not only dialogue, but patterns of behavior over time that demonstrate restraint and predictability. Economic signaling plays a role here as well. Decisions about opening or closing sectors to foreign investment, about protecting or sharing intellectual property, and about adhering to international trade norms all send messages about reliability. Similarly, military transparency, participation in international exercises, and adherence to maritime rules convey information about strategic posture. Each side watches for consistency between words and deeds. Another important factor is the role of regional institutions and multilateral forums. Even when bilateral ties are strained, both countries participate in global organizations that address trade, finance, health, and security. These venues provide structured settings where disputes can be aired and, at times, moderated. They also expose both countries to the expectations and pressures of a wider community of states, which often favor stability and rule-based interaction. Economic development within China continues to reshape the global landscape. As consumption rises and services expand, China's role evolves from primarily a manufacturing hub to also a major market and source of investment. This transformation alters trade patterns and creates new linkages with other regions. For the United States, adapting to this shift involves not only managing competition, but also finding areas where commercial engagement remains mutually beneficial. Innovation ecosystems in both countries are increasingly central to national strategy. Universities, research institutes, and private firms operate at the intersection of knowledge and policy. Restrictions aimed at protecting sensitive research must be balanced against the benefits of collaboration. The scientific community often advocates openness, while security agencies emphasize caution. Navigating this tension is a recurring challenge. Public narratives about the relationship influence the political space for leaders. When the other country is portrayed primarily as a threat, compromise becomes politically risky. When engagement is seen as beneficial, dialogue becomes easier to justify. Media, education, and political rhetoric all contribute to these narratives, shaping expectations that policymakers must consider. Energy transitions add another dimension. As both countries invest in renewable energy and new technologies, they compete for leadership in industries that will define future growth. At the same time, global climate goals require cooperation among the largest emitters. Policies that support domestic industries can also affect global supply chains and trade relations, illustrating again how domestic and international considerations intertwine. The question of values remains present, even when not always at the forefront of official statements. Human rights, political freedoms, and governance practices are part of how each country defines itself. Differences in these areas can generate friction, especially when one side speaks out about the other's internal policies. Balancing these concerns with the need for practical cooperation is a delicate and ongoing task. Historical memory continues to inform strategic culture. American leaders often draw lessons from past experiences with rising powers and from the Cold War, emphasizing deterrence and alliance solidarity. Chinese leaders draw lessons from periods of fragmentation and foreign intervention, emphasizing unity, sovereignty, and caution about external influence. These memories shape how risks are assessed and which outcomes are seen as acceptable. Technology-driven change, from artificial intelligence to biotechnology, will likely create new issues that have not yet been fully imagined. Regulatory frameworks, ethical standards, and security implications will need to be addressed. The way the United States and China interact in setting or contesting these frameworks will influence global norms. Despite the weight of competition, areas of quiet cooperation persist. Aviation safety, disaster response, and disease surveillance are examples where practical needs encourage information sharing. These efforts rarely make headlines, but they contribute to global stability and can build habits of communication. The relationship's future will be shaped by the interplay between structural forces and human agency. Structural factors include economic size, geography, technological capacity, and military strength. Human agency lies in leadership decisions, diplomatic skill, and the willingness to imagine alternatives to confrontation. History shows that moments of creative diplomacy can alter trajectories, just as misjudgments can have lasting consequences. What remains clear is that the relationship between the United States and China is not a temporary feature of international politics. It is a defining axis of the current era, with roots stretching back centuries and implications reaching far ahead. Its course will influence the rules, institutions, and expectations that govern global affairs. Managing it wisely requires not only attention to immediate disputes, but also an understanding of the deeper historical currents that have shaped it from the beginning. If we follow the thread all the way from the age of sail to the age of algorithms, what stands out is how often the relationship has been redefined by forces neither side fully controlled. In the 19th century, industrialization in the West and internal strain in China set the stage for unequal encounters. In the mid-20th century, global ideological conflict pulled the two countries into opposing camps. In the late 20th century, the logic of economic reform and globalization drew them together. In the early 21st, technological change and shifting power balances have pushed them into a more openly competitive posture. At each stage, leaders made choices, but those choices were framed by broader transformations. One recurring theme is asymmetry in perception. The United States, for much of its history, saw itself as engaging with many regions at once, one global actor among several. China, especially in periods of vulnerability, often experienced interactions with major powers as deeply consequential to its core interests. Today, that asymmetry can still appear in reverse ways. American policymakers balance China alongside other global priorities, while Chinese policymakers see the United States as the primary external factor shaping their strategic environment. This difference in focus can lead to mismatched expectations about the importance of particular issues. Economic numbers illustrate the scale of change. Trade that once involved a handful of merchant ships now amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Financial links connect central banks, investors, and corporations across borders. Disruptions in one economy can ripple through the other and outward to the rest of the world. This level of integration is unprecedented in the history of relations between major powers with such different political systems. Yet integration does not erase national identity or strategic concern. Instead, it creates a situation in which cooperation and rivalry operate side by side. A company may depend on suppliers in the other country while policymakers debate export restrictions. Scientists may collaborate on research while governments worry about intellectual property. These crosscurrents make the relationship resistant to simple characterization. Military modernization adds another layer of complexity. Both countries invest in advanced capabilities designed to operate across domains: land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. Deterrence depends not only on raw capability, but on credible communication of limits and intentions. The risk lies in the possibility that signals are misunderstood or that technological speed outpaces diplomatic mechanisms. Domestic resilience becomes a strategic concept. Each country seeks to strengthen its own economy, infrastructure, and social cohesion, in part to better compete internationally. Investments in education, innovation, and public health are seen as foundations of long-term strength. Thus, the bilateral relationship influences internal policy priorities, reinforcing the link between domestic renewal and global position. The broader world does not stand still while Washington and Beijing interact. Emerging economies, regional conflicts, and transnational challenges create a shifting backdrop. In some cases, the United States and China find themselves cooperating in multilateral settings. In others, they support different partners or visions. Their interaction is therefore woven into a wider tapestry of global politics. Historical turning points remind us that dramatic change is possible. Few observers in the 1960s predicted the diplomatic breakthrough of the 1970s. few in the 1990s anticipated the speed of China's economic ascent. The future may hold surprises of similar magnitude. Technological breakthroughs, leadership changes, or global crises could alter trajectories in ways that are hard to foresee. Throughout these shifts, the human element remains central. Diplomats build relationships, military officers establish protocols, business leaders negotiate deals, and citizens form impressions through travel, study, and media. These personal interactions can either reinforce mistrust or create understanding that moderates it. The challenge for both countries is to manage rivalry without allowing it to define every interaction. History suggests that rigid hostility narrows options, while selective cooperation can coexist with competition. Finding that balance requires constant adjustment, informed by awareness of how past experiences continue to shape present perceptions. The story of the United States and China, then, is not simply about two governments. It is about societies encountering each other across time, learning, clashing, adapting, and influencing the wider world. From tea and porcelain to data and satellites, the mediums have changed, but the central question endures. How can two powerful, different nations share a global system without sliding into destructive conflict? And while still pursuing their own visions of prosperity and security as we move further into the present, it becomes clear that uncertainty itself has become a defining feature of the relationship. In earlier decades, even during confrontation, the structure of global politics provided clearer reference points. During the Cold War, ideological blocs and alliance systems created a relatively stable, if tense, framework. In the era of early engagement, optimism about economic integration offered a guiding assumption. Today, no single framework commands the same confidence. Both countries are adapting to a world where technological change is rapid, global institutions are under strain, and power is distributed in more complex ways. This uncertainty affects strategic planning. Long-term policies must be crafted in an environment where assumptions about markets, security, and technology may shift quickly. Leaders must prepare for multiple scenarios, balancing deterrence with engagement, resilience with openness. This can produce policies that appear contradictory because they are attempts to hedge against different possible futures. Economic decoupling, a term that has entered public debate, illustrates this tension. Complete separation of the two economies would be extraordinarily costly and disruptive. Yet partial decoupling in sensitive sectors is already underway. Companies re-examine supply chains, governments impose restrictions in targeted areas, and new trade partnerships are explored. The result is a more segmented form of globalization, where strategic considerations shape patterns of exchange. The information environment adds to complexity. News, analysis, and commentary circulate instantly, often amplifying dramatic or negative stories. Public understanding of the other country can be shaped by viral images or selective reporting, making it harder to sustain nuanced discussion. At the same time, digital connectivity allows for direct communication among individuals, scholars, and professionals, creating opportunities to bypass official narratives. In security affairs, the concept of deterrence has expanded beyond traditional military domains. Cyber capabilities, economic sanctions, and technological controls are all tools through which states signal resolve and impose costs. Managing escalation in these areas is challenging because norms are less established and actions can be deniable or ambiguous. Dialogue on these issues is complicated but increasingly necessary. Climate and environmental stress may become more central over time. Extreme weather, resource scarcity, and ecological degradation create pressures that do not respect national borders. Cooperation in these areas can build trust and produce shared benefits, but it requires political will that may be constrained by other disputes. The generational dimension continues to evolve. Young people in both countries navigate a world shaped by global culture, digital platforms, and transnational issues. Their experiences may differ from those of earlier generations shaped by the Cold War or the initial years of reform and opening. How they interpret national identity, global responsibility, and the other country's role will influence the long-term trajectory. Throughout this unfolding story, one lesson from history stands out. The relationship has rarely remained static for long. Periods of tension have given way to recalibration, and periods of cooperation have contained seeds of future disagreement. Adaptability has been essential. Both countries have, at critical moments, adjusted strategies in response to new realities. The stakes of these adjustments are high, not only for the two nations, but for the global community. Trade routes, financial systems, technological standards, and security arrangements all depend in part on how the United States and China manage their interaction. Stability in this relationship supports broader stability. Sharp deterioration can have far-reaching consequences. In the end, the history of competition and cooperation between the United States and China is a story about managing difference at scale. It is about how nations with distinct histories, political systems, and ambitions interact within a shared world. It is about the tension between national goals and global interdependence. And it is about the enduring possibility that, even amid rivalry, pragmatic choices can prevent conflict and allow space for collaboration where interests align. That story, begun with fragile trade links across oceans, continues to unfold in boardrooms, research labs, diplomatic meetings, and public debates. Its direction will be shaped not by inevitability, but by decisions, perceptions, and the ability of both societies to learn from the long, intricate past that has brought them to this point. In tracing this relationship across centuries, another pattern becomes visible. Moments of greatest strain have often coincided with periods when each country was redefining itself internally. In the mid-19th century, the United States was expanding westward, debating slavery and building an industrial economy, while China struggled with rebellion and reform. After World War II, China underwent revolution and state building as the United States adjusted to global leadership in a bipolar world. In the reform era, China restructured its economy just as the United States navigated globalization and technological transformation. Today, both societies again face internal transitions, from demographic shifts to economic restructuring, and these domestic processes influence how each views external challenges. National identity plays a quiet but powerful role. For the United States, identity has long been linked to ideas of individual liberty, opportunity, and a belief in universal principles. For China, identity is often tied to civilizational continuity, collective resilience, and the restoration of national strength. These narratives shape public expectations of foreign policy. Actions abroad are judged not only by their practical results, but by whether they align with these deeper stories about who the nation is. Economic development has also altered social expectations. Rising living standards in China have created a middle class with global awareness and varied aspirations. In the United States, economic change has generated both innovation and dislocation, influencing political debates about trade, technology, and fairness. These domestic discussions feed back into attitudes toward the bilateral relationship. Strategic competition increasingly extends into emerging regions and domains. Infrastructure investment, digital connectivity, and development financing are areas where influence is exercised through long-term partnerships rather than immediate confrontation. Countries receiving such investment weigh benefits against concerns about debt, sovereignty, and alignment. The United States and China offer different approaches, and their competition unfolds through offers, standards, and relationships rather than through direct conflict. In the realm of global governance, the two countries sometimes cooperate to reform institutions and at other times support different visions. Debates over voting rights in financial institutions, the structure of development banks, and rules for trade and investment reflect broader questions about representation and fairness in the international system. These debates are shaped by history, by perceptions of past exclusion or dominance. Communication between the two governments involves multiple layers, from leader-level summits to technical working groups. Even when high-level relations cool, lower-level contacts often continue, addressing practical issues such as transportation, agriculture, or environmental monitoring. These routine interactions form the infrastructure of diplomacy, providing continuity amid political shifts. Crisis management remains a central concern. Historical experience shows how quickly incidents can escalate when trust is low. Mechanisms such as military hotlines, agreed codes of conduct, and regular dialogue are designed to reduce this risk. Their effectiveness depends on political will and mutual recognition of shared interest in avoiding conflict. The interplay of competition and cooperation in this relationship reflects a broader challenge in international politics: how to integrate rising powers into existing systems while allowing those systems to evolve. The United States and China are both, in different ways, products and shapers of the modern international order. Their interaction influences whether that order becomes more fragmented or more adaptable. Cultural exchange, though sometimes overshadowed, continues to provide channels for empathy and understanding. Artistic collaboration, academic study, and tourism expose individuals to different ways of life, complicating simple narratives. These experiences can influence long-term attitudes even if their impact on immediate policy is indirect. Looking ahead, uncertainty remains the only constant. Technological breakthroughs, environmental shocks, economic crises, or political changes could shift priorities rapidly. The capacity to adapt, to communicate clearly, and to recognize shared interests amid competition will be critical. The long history between the United States and China shows that rivalry does not preclude cooperation, and cooperation does not eliminate rivalry. The two have often coexisted, sometimes uneasily, sometimes productively. Understanding this layered past helps illuminate the present, revealing that today's tensions are part of a broader continuum rather than an entirely new departure. As this story continues, it will be shaped by decisions made in capitals and communities alike. The balance struck between caution and engagement, between defending interests and seeking common ground, will determine not only the future of bilateral ties, but also the character of the wider international system in which both nations play such central roles. If we look across the full sweep of this history, what becomes clear is that the relationship between the United States and China has always been shaped by the intersection of power, perception, and change. When the first American traders sailed to the Qing Empire, neither side imagined that their interaction would one day influence the structure of the global economy, the balance of military forces across the Pacific, or the rules governing emerging technologies. Yet step by step, through commerce, conflict, diplomacy, and adaptation, the connection deepened until it became one of the central axes of international life. Each era redefined what the relationship meant. In the beginning, it was about access to goods and markets, framed within unequal systems of global power. In the early 20th century, it was tied to revolution, nationalism, and the struggle to define modern statehood. During World War II, it was an alliance of necessity. In the Cold War, it became a line of confrontation, then an unexpected channel of strategic realignment. In the age of reform and globalization, it turned into a dense web of trade, investment, and human exchange. In the present, it is marked by strategic competition layered atop deep interdependence. What makes this history unusual is not simply the scale of the two countries, but the way their interactions have repeatedly moved between cooperation and rivalry without settling permanently into either. The same relationship that produced battlefield confrontation in Korea later enabled diplomatic coordination against a shared rival. The same economic ties that brought mutual prosperity also generated tensions over fairness and security. This duality has been a constant feature rather than an exception. At the heart of the story lies a recurring tension between integration and autonomy. Both countries have benefited from engagement with the wider world and with each other. At the same time, both have sought to preserve freedom of action, protect domestic stability, and shape their own development paths. When integration appears to threaten autonomy, pressure builds for limits. When autonomy seems to carry high costs, incentives for cooperation re-emerge. The relationship moves within this space, never fixed, always adjusting. Historical memory continues to give depth to present choices. For China, the experience of weakness in the 19th and early 20th centuries reinforces sensitivity to sovereignty and external pressure. For the United States, the experience of global leadership and alliance networks reinforces commitments to open systems and security partnerships. These memories do not dictate policy, but they influence how risks are weighed and which outcomes seem acceptable. Another enduring feature is the role of adaptation. Neither country has simply followed a straight line of predetermined policy. Shifts in leadership, domestic conditions, and global context have produced reassessments. Engagement policies were revised when expectations changed. Confrontational stances have been moderated when costs became clear. This capacity to adjust, even after periods of tension, has prevented the relationship from becoming locked into a single pattern. The broader world has always been affected by these shifts. Smaller states have adjusted their strategies in response to the balance between Washington and Beijing. Global markets have responded to changes in trade and financial policy. International institutions have been shaped by cooperation or disagreement between the two. The relationship's impact extends far beyond bilateral concerns, influencing how global challenges are addressed. As the narrative reaches the present, the defining characteristic is complexity. The United States and China are competitors in some domains, partners in others, and unavoidable interlocutors in most. Their economies are linked even as they seek to reduce certain dependencies. Their militaries prepare for worst-case scenarios even as diplomats maintain channels to prevent those scenarios from unfolding. Their societies exchange ideas, students, and culture even amid political disagreement. History suggests that such complexity is not a temporary phase, but a structural condition of their interaction. The relationship has never been simple, and efforts to reduce it to a single label have often obscured more than they clarified. It is a relationship shaped by cycles, by overlapping interests and fears, and by the constant interplay between domestic priorities and international realities. What ultimately determines the direction of this story is not fate, but choice. Leaders interpret history, assess risks, and decide how to act. Societies debate priorities and hold those leaders accountable. Institutions channel cooperation or competition. Even in moments of tension, the possibility of adjustment remains, just as in moments of cooperation, the potential for disagreement persists. From the first exchange of ginseng for tea to negotiations over digital standards and climate commitments, the relationship between the United States and China has reflected the evolving nature of global power. It shows how nations with different systems and histories can become deeply connected, how that connection can produce both prosperity and friction, and how managing such a relationship requires continual effort. This long history does not offer simple predictions, but it does offer perspective. It reminds us that dramatic shifts have occurred before, that rivalry has coexisted with dialogue, and that periods of danger have sometimes led to new forms of understanding. It also shows that neglecting communication, misreading intentions, or underestimating the other side's concerns can have lasting consequences. In the end, the story is not just about two governments, but about two societies navigating a shared world. Their interaction will continue to shape trade routes, technological development, security arrangements, and global responses to common challenges. The patterns established over more than 2 centuries suggest that the balance between competition and cooperation will remain fluid, influenced by changing circumstances and human judgment. The history of the United States and China is therefore best understood not as a march toward inevitable conflict or inevitable partnership, but as an ongoing negotiation over how two powerful nations coexist in a single international system. That negotiation, shaped by memory, interest, and adaptation, is one of the defining processes of the modern era, and its outcome will resonate far beyond the shores of the Pacific.